Welcome to my lecture on associative conditioning. So we have seen declarative memories. Now we're going to see another type of memory, an associative memory. It's called associative conditioning. It's something that is extremely widespread. Essentially every animal does it, and it's been also very fundamental for the creation of artificial systems. As we're going to see, the ideas we're going to see today will lead to reinforcement learning, and so they form an important part of current trends in artificial intelligence. So I will talk about classical conditioning, the experiments by Pavlov, then two properties, extinction and blocking. Then I will speak about a simple model, the Rescorla-Wagner rule, which is essentially the beginning, the first step towards reinforcement learning. Then we look at operant conditioning, the notions of reinforcement and punishment, and then we'll talk about timing dependence of affective valence. Good, so let's get started with Pavlov's experiment. So he was a brilliant Russian physiologist, and he did those experiments where he noticed that when you give food to a dog, food is an unconditioned stimulus, then dogs will tend to salivate. That's the unconditioned response. That's what dogs do naturally when you give them food. And he noticed that when you pair the presentation of food with the sound of a tuning fork, the dog would salivate, but then surprisingly, when you play the tuning fork alone, the dog would start to salivate, which is something that dogs normally do not do. That's why we speak of the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. So the tuning fork became the conditioned stimulus. It was conditioned by the presentation with the food, and the conditioned response is the salivation, which is actually not exhibited if you play the tuning fork without pairing, obviously. So Pavlov called this kind of psychic secretion, he said. There was something, some psychic substance that is released in the brain that would essentially realize this kind of change in behavior. And he did a lot of clever experiments discovering the properties of this classical conditioning. So one of the first properties is extinction, namely when you stop pairing the tuning fork with the food, namely when you present the food alone after some time without giving the sound of the tuning fork, then this kind of association will disappear. It will become extinct, which means the dog will no longer salivate. So what is important for this classical conditioning to work? How reliable does this pairing need to be? On a very simple level, if you have a different form of conditioning, namely you have a tone with an electric shock. When you present an electric shock alone, then animals would freeze. They're essentially afraid, and that's the way of signaling the unconditioned response. So when you now pair shocks very reliably, which means there is not a single shock that is unpaired, right? Then it doesn't matter that you have a few stimuli too many. The animal will freeze as soon as you present the stimulus, right? It rather overgeneralize a bit and go into the freezing mode when there is a sound, given that these shocks never occur without the sound. But then when people notice when you start presenting unpaired shocks, like here in green, shocks that could not be predicted, then the animal kind of learns that the sound is not a perfect predictor of the shock, in that shocks can occur outside of it, which means it will not freeze as reliably. When the pairing is even, or the unpaired shocks are even more frequent, there's 40% of them that are not occurring together with the tone, then the freezing is even less. I guess which makes sense in a way, because animals will not freeze all the time, given that they could get a shock also outside of the tones. It's kind of, it makes sense that the animal would not freeze all the time, and so they would have a low probability of freezing. So the reliability of the association is important, and what is particularly important is there should be few false negatives, right? Here, false positives is fine, but false negatives is kind of not very conducive for this classical conditioning to occur. Now, there's a simple, beautiful model of classical conditioning. It's called the Rescorla-Wagner model. What they hypothesized is that there is some kind of computation going on about the expected reward. This is what animals care about. So the expected reward, we call it V here, is the multiplication of W times U, where U dictates the presence of the conditioned stimulus, so whether the sound of the tuning fork is present or not, 1 if it's present, 0 otherwise, and W is the weight. It's the weight of this association. And they assume that the weight always starts out by 0, which means the expected reward for an unconditioned stimulus is 0, right? Why would a tuning fork by nature predict food? It's not the case, so W starts by 0 everywhere. So weights, they change when there is a prediction error here. So when the reward that the animal actually gets is larger than the expected reward, then this error is positive, and then the weights will change in proportion to this positive error, right? When this conditioned stimulus is present, and epsilon is a small learning rate. So now how this looks like when you simulate this system in which you suddenly at time 0 start turning on the conditioned stimulus, then the U appears and the W, so the weight for that stimulus, starts increasing. So that's conditioning until it reaches 1, which means the conditioning stimulus perfectly predicts the reward, right? At which case delta is 0 up here. And extinction now, when you suddenly do not pair anymore the conditioned stimulus with the reward, then you have that R is 0 and V is large, which means delta is negative. And when delta is negative, then you can see the weights will start decreasing again by virtue of this learning rule, which means here the weight decays back to 0. This is extinction. So this simple model can explain extinction and can explain the classical conditioning, the association of the unconditioned stimulus with the the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned response. When now the pairing is less reliable, when you have some omissions, then you get just the weight is not perfectly 1. The weight is here reaches just a lower value over here. And now what about blocking? Blocking happens when you have 2 stimuli that could be potentially predicting a reward. So here, when we have 2 stimuli, then we simply turn this product between W and U into a scalar product. So W is now a weight vector and U is a presence vector. So U, the component, the ice component of that vector is 1 if that conditional stimulus is present, and it is 0 otherwise. So now we have a weight for each type of stimulus that is present. And the learning rule is the same. We have W changes in proportion to U and delta is still the difference between the reward and the expected reward. Now what happens if you have a conditioned stimulus that is here turned on at 0, leads to the weight to approach 1, and then you introduce a new stimulus, a second conditioned stimulus. So you're pairing with the food presentation, not just the sound of a fork, but there's some other stimulus, maybe some visual display, some ball you put on the floor or something. What is going to happen now, according to the Rescorla-Wagner learning rule? Well, you can easily convince yourself that V, at this point in time here, when you introduce the new stimulus, V is W times U, and W equals 1 completely predicts the reward, right? So V equals R just by virtue of the association of the stimulus 1, which means this one will contribute nothing because W2 is 0 by definition. At the beginning, when you present a new stimulus, its weight is 0. Now, because V, the expected reward, equals R, the actual reward delta must be 0, which means that the weight 2 with the new stimulus will not change because it is the change is multiplied here by 0, which means the weight 2 will be 0, which means the second stimulus will not be associated with the reward. This is called blocking. The first stimulus that has already learned the pairing blocks the pairing of the second stimulus. So the association. Again, showing that this simple formalism is very effective in predicting some properties of classical conditioning. Now, there are many more properties than just extinction and blocking. It's a very rich field, not so actively researched anymore, but we won't go into it. This is for us a good motivation for what will be following later on. Now, classical conditioning is an association between some stimulus and an unconditioned response, like salivation. It's not really a way you can train an animal to elicit a particular behavior. If you want to train an animal, then what you do is operant conditioning. It's also called conditioning because you pair again things. You pair a stimulus, this time not with some kind of reward, but this time with a behavior that the animal exhibits, and then you're trying to increase that behavior by presenting a reward, for example. So in classical conditioning, like here in the Skinner box, so Skinner was a famous psychologist who is also a bit called the father of operant conditioning. So he had those boxes and he trained rats and pigeons also to do amazing things. For example, he trained pigeons to discriminate English from French texts, and the pigeons could even do it when you remove the French accents from the letters. So he did pretty amazing things with his Skinner boxes. And a typical experiment in the box is such that there's a light, a green or a red light. When the green light appears and the animal presses a lever, then some food pellet appears. When the red light appears and the rat presses the lever, there is no food, or even worse, could be an electric shock over here. So animals would learn to press the lever when the light is green simply because, I guess, out of curiosity, initially the animal will get bored in his box and start pressing things, and occasionally would press the lever when the light is green and then would learn the association. So that's why we also speak of reinforcement, right? The food pellet reinforces the behavior. And so it is, and the association is now between this stimulus, the green light, and the behavior of pressing the lever that leads to the delivery of the food pellet. So we can distinguish two types of ways of changing the behavior in an animal, right? We can increase the behavior with a reinforcement, that's a reward, or we can decrease the behavior by punishing, essentially. For each of those two cases, people have distinguished subcases. They speak of positive reinforcement, when we add an appetitive stimulus following the behavior to be reinforced, right? So when we for example, deliver the food after the rat presses the green lever, that's a positive reinforcement. We also speak of negative reinforcement, and for example, we can speak of escapes, when we remove an aversive stimulus following the behavior to be reinforced, right? There's an aversive stimulus, maybe there's some I don't know, some sound that is very loud, and then when the rat presses the lever, the sound disappears, so you can escape from it. We can also speak of avoidance in negative reinforcement, when we have for example, when the behavior to be reinforced avoids aversive stimulus, right? When the rat, for example, the light turns green, and then the rat gets, or let's say the light turns red, and then the rat experiences an electroshock. But when it presses the lever after the light turns red, then a rat could avoid the electroshock. So it's the avoidance of the appearance of an aversive stimulus, whereas here it's the escape from the presence of an aversive stimulus. With punishment, you can do the same distinctions. You can speak of positive punishment. It's when you add an aversive stimulus following the behavior to be decreased, right? This is just punishing, right? When you when you speak with an angry voice to a child because it dropped a fork or something, then it will hopefully not do that anymore. It's this kind of pairing of punishment that makes it not do it anymore. You can also have negative punishment, which sounds like a weird concept. It's when you remove the appetitive stimulus following the behavior to be decreased, where let's say you take the ice cream away when the child drops the fork, right? That's a negative punishment. You took away the pleasant thing that was there. So all of these forms have been studied, and some people have argued, well, maybe it's not so easy to distinguish these two. Let's look at their arguments over here. If we have a rat in the Skinner box and it's very cold, and now when the rat presses the lever, a heat lamp turns on, what are we dealing with here? Are we dealing with positive reinforcement, right? Are we dealing with the rat learning to get this positive signal here, which is the warmth from the lamp? Or are we dealing with negative reinforcement, that the rat learns to escape from the cold by pressing the lever? So it depends, I guess, whether we speak of positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. It depends a bit on what the baseline is. Are we already in a pleasant situation or not? But how long this state has been present, right? Whether it's been for a long time in the cold environment or not. So some people argue that it's not. One shouldn't draw these distinctions between positive and negative reinforcement. That's why it's not used so much anymore, these terms. People speak of reward, and they speak of punishment, and in general they speak of reinforcement, for example, aversive reinforcement when they mean punishment, and just positive reinforcement or reinforcement when they speak of reward. So, of course, as always, biology is more surprising than these simple characteristics that we have here of classifying a stimulus as either being punishing or rewarding. Biology will find ways of actually confusing the two, which means sometimes a given stimulus can be rewarding and sometimes it can be punishing. And people have shown that whether you have the punishing or the rewarding side can actually depend on just time and nothing else. So here's an elegant experiment that was done on flies less than 20 years ago. So people have presented odors to a fly that are mildly aversive, so odor A and B. And what they did is they paired an electric shock that is strongly aversive with the odor B. And they changed the timing of the shock with the odor, so this ISI, interstimulus interval. And what they found, surprisingly, is when the interstimulus interval is negative over here, then this learning index, which signals whether the flies, they avoid the stimulus, which is here on the positive side of the y-axis, or whether they approach the stimulus, which is on the negative side. So when it turns out when they present the odor before the shock, then the animals will avoid it. That's kind of a simple punishment, the idea of punishment. But the surprising part now is when they present the odor before the shock. Sorry, no, when they present the odor after the shock, and the ISI is positive, then actually the flies will mildly approach, but significantly approach the odor. So the affective valence of that particular odor B depends on the time of presentation, whether it's before or after the shock. So that's kind of a surprising finding, and it was done in flies, and I would assume it also applies to humans. And I guess it could have some implications for how we educate our children, because it turns out after we punish our children, whatever stimulus we expose them to might be actually a positively effective a stimulus with a positive valence, so that a stimulus that they will like. I don't think many parents are aware of this. Okay, that's all I wanted to say about associative conditioning. So we talked about classical and about operant conditioning. And these concepts should be clear now, and we should be able to answer the question, is aversive reinforcement the same as negative reinforcement? Are these the same thing? Another question, according to the Rescorla-Wagner rule, why does blocking occur? If you had to summarize in one sentence, why does blocking occur? And also now another a bit more question from a more distant vantage point is which side of the learning index curve is in better agreement with notions of spike time dependent plasticity? So when you think about this STDP learning rule, could it explain at least part of this behavior in flies, that the affective valence of a stimulus depends on the time of presentation? Okay, so I hope you found this lecture useful, and I'm happy to talk about these questions after the lecture time.